Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Optimizing Assortments by Focusing on Attribute-Based Demand Patterns. I'm Adam Blair, Executive Editor of Retail Touchpoints, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Retailers have always sought ways to match their product assortments with the needs and wants of their customer base. It's the old retail mantra, the right product in the right place at the right time. During today's webinar, attendees will learn how to analyze the everyday shopper's buying behavior using retail data pattern recognition principles and apply those principles to the retail environment. This webinar event is part of the Retail Touchpoints 2018 Connected Consumer Series. During this series, attendees have the opportunity to hear from leading industry experts who are discussing the most important topics on retailers' minds today. By registering for one session, attendees will have access to all complimentary presentations live and on demand. We also welcome you to follow this and all other Connected Consumer Series webinars on Twitter using the CC Series hashtag. On this slide, you'll also find the Twitter handles for Retail Touchpoints and the session speakers. As an attendee of the Connected Consumer Series, you also have the opportunity to win a free pass to the Retail Innovation Conference, set for April 30th through May 2nd in New York City. You've already earned one entry into the lottery by registering for this event. You're receiving a second for attending live. One free ticket will be given away each day of the series. For today's presentation, we're using the On24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the On24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. By clicking on the Questions widget on the right-hand side of the screen, you can type in questions during the live presentation and press Submit. You can also find a widget named Resources under Questions. Here you can download assets our presenters have provided. All you have to do is click on the resource, and it will automatically download. If you're not able to attend one or more of the sessions, they're all available free to all registrants. You can access them on demand at your convenience. To learn more, go to the Retail Touchpoints website. The link is displayed on this slide. In addition to joining the conversation online and submitting your questions on the On24 platform, we also welcome and encourage you to participate by letting us know how we're doing with our webinar series. We want to constantly improve the level of value we provide to you, our session attendees, so we put together a very brief survey that will automatically launch once this session concludes. You also can complete and submit the survey by clicking on the survey icon in the taskbar on the bottom of your screen. The survey icon is circled here in red on this slide. Before signing off today, please take a moment to complete this quick questionnaire. We appreciate and value your feedback and look forward to hearing from you. For those of you who may be new to Retail Touchpoints, here's a quick overview. We're an all-digital media company publishing 3 weekly email online newsletters, daily news, special reports, and multimedia presentations. We also host the annual Retail Innovation Conference in New York in May. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter. We welcome input and feedback through traditional means, phone and email, and social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Our website is www.retailtouchpoints.com. That the presentation is slated for approximately 30 minutes, but there's time for live questions at the end. We invite the audience to submit questions in the On24 questions area as they come to mind. Our presenters have agreed to stay online following the presentation to respond to the questions. I also want to point out just a few other housekeeping items for today's attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an archive link to the presentation to go back and review or share with colleagues. In addition, the slides will be posted to SlideShare. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Marcia Shapiro is responsible for the strategy and design of the 4R Systems product suite. She has over 20 years of retail software design and implementation experience, managing the entire product lifecycle using an agile framework. Marcia has held executive positions with leading software providers, implementing merchandising and marketing applications at retailers and wholesalers such as Ahold, Walmart, Target, Associated Warehouse Group, Family Dollar, and Belk. Her deep retail knowledge stems from having led process improvement efforts and implementing technology as a certified Six Sigma Black Belt for the Home Depot. Early in Marcia's career, she was an IT management consultant with Ernst & Young and authored the Pocket Idiot's Guide to Six Sigma. Welcome, Marcia. Kevin Stadler is responsible for the continued strategic expansion and overall operations at 4R. He has over 25 years' experience in retail technology, product strategy, sales, and software design. Prior to joining 4R, Stadler was head of customer engagement solutions for Symphony EYC, responsible for leading the product direction and business activities worldwide. Welcome, Kevin. Now I'm going to turn things over to Marcia.
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to take you through the agenda. First, we're going to talk about the benefit of localizing assortment, along with the guiding principles of optimizing your assortment. We'll focus specifically on attribute demand and how utilizing this input can assist you across your organization, as well as ensure you have the optimal assortment. Kevin and I will also focus on discussing how your customer buying behavior, once identified, can be utilized to determine what new products should be offered by your chain. Lastly, we'll talk about the importance of a solid assortment optimization workflow and how quickly you can get up and running to begin achieving the benefits.
So the first question that many people ask when looking at the idea of localized assortments is it worth it? And we'd like to point out, number one, that localized consumer preferences outpace size-based clusters. And it outpaces them in two different dimensions. One is in revenue performance, and the other one is in frequency. Most size-based clusters are based off of a category management schedule that is time-based. The reality of doing localized assortments is that as you find customer preference shifts, you can adjust and do it in real time. The second part of that, which is that revenue improvement, which is the performance, is that as you measure what is the difference between size-based or traditional, let's just say, category management techniques, is that this way of looking at things from attribute-based provides revenue improvements of anywhere from 3 to over 20%. Of course, it depends on the category that you're dealing with and how variant the existing assortments are versus what the new ones are. This concept is built off of predictive analytics, and it uses machine learning, and it provides very deep insights with looking at the information as it's mined to provide you with different ways of looking at it and vastly improved efficiencies. The last is that all of these things can be implemented in less than 6 months with very limited IT resources, which is different than most projects and different than most radical changes that can be done for revenue improvement. Why would you do assortment optimization of this sort? First, if you look at what had been looked at traditionally, is that understanding customer preferences clearly is a key to driving traffic in stores. Many of the surveys which have been done in the past indicate that this is one of the greatest gaps in terms of retail current functionality versus what people would like to have. The second part, which is interesting as well, is that reports, and the one that we're looking at in the center is a Gartner report that shows that traditional SKU rationalization, meaning process-based tools or size-based clusters, don't go far enough, and that you do need to look at big data and optimization to do that. And the last point that we would make is that there's been a lot of research done on the idea of the endless assortment or the endless aisle. And clearly, all of the research indicates that too much choice actually confuses the consumer, even in an online setting, and that there is a reason why you would cut the tail off of any assortment in any situation in order to produce better results by providing consumers with clear choices and giving them enough choice. So how do you do this? What are some of the guiding principles that we're going to talk through? The first one is a very deep idea and concept that you have to use true demand, not just point-of-sale data. And it's typically an error that people make early on, is just to feed point-of-sale information in. It has to be normalized, and it has to take things like demand transference into account, as well as do a variety of other techniques. And Marcia's going to talk a little bit more about those in just a second. Second is understanding the consumer buying patterns and doing that in an attribute-based methodology. The customer decision tree is essentially an idea behind what are the features or the attributes that matter most to my customers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you determine which attributes matter and how you determine which ones you want to use in terms of setting future assortments. Demand transference, a key type of thought process, which is not just what products or attributes can be substituted for each other, but it's also how you look at the measure of transference on a percentage basis between either products or attributes one to the other. And the last point here is an idea behind granularity. Should you increase or decrease localization efforts, and ways that you can actually measure those and look at things like constraints, shelf, store size, space, localization preferences against inventory investment and achieving the right balance using a very clear-cut technique on how to measure and do that.
The first point that Kevin talked about is really understanding true demand and ensuring that whatever forecasting engine you're using applies these particular principles. Traditional forecasting approaches look strictly at POS history, and they attempt to predict future sales, usually very poorly. For example, by only looking at POS, you'll not understand if the product didn't sell because it was in the back room or if it was out of stock. But when focusing on consumer demand, retailers can strip out those lost sales, outliers, promotions, and seasonality in order to determine the true demand for a product. Once the retailer layers back in the future demand effects, a more accurate forecast can be determined. The next step to effective optimization is to determine demand by attribute. Attributes being the key determinant in customers' buying decision. So how's attribute demand determined? Most importantly, you have to have clean, normalized attributes that accurately represent a customer's buying pattern. This is also known as the decision tree, as Kevin talked about, and often identifies attributes of a product that most closely explain a customer's purchasing decisions. By estimating the true demand, as previously discussed, down to an attribute level, you now have the ability to determine what combination of attributes or products should be sold in what stores. Where should your existing product mix be expanded? Likewise, if the combination of attributes with a high estimated demand doesn't exist in the chain, you also have the potential to design or source brand new products. As attribute demand is investigated, the level of substitution between the attributes will also be evident. And understanding how the customers are willing to forego an attribute for another product attribute will enable you to ensure that if you remove a product from your assortment, you're not going to lose that customer. In this example, you can see the demand is relatively high for certain price points, but those price points are not always carried in certain sizes, one of the product attributes that's important to this product, as well as to the customer's buying decision around this product category. If we optimized our assortment solely based on historical sales, we'd miss several opportunities to increase revenue by expanding assortments within certain price points. Substitution rates can also differ and should be estimated and taken into account in determining the assortment.
One of the keys to understanding consumer patterns and demand is an ability to dissect how the customer thinks about each product in each category. And this idea typically is viewed as one which is a customer decision tree. In other words, how do they think about a product category? In illustration here, we're using detergent. And the thought process is, as a consumer walks into a location or online, pulls up a website, what do they think about first in terms of their key decision as to whether they want this product or not? Is it brand? Is it the form factor in terms of powder, detergent, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding this concept can lead to very critical shopper insights. Things like adjacencies. What products are offered either, and we're using aisle, but the concept is one of either online or in-store. What do they see around it? What are the other products? What are things in terms of the attributes which are things that they will choose on and ones that they will have the ability or possibly would substitute on? As you saw in the previous example, there were certain price points that people would actually substitute on. And as we also pointed out, there were ways and percentages that they went back and forth on each of them. The churn predictions on each of these in terms of how often are they going to change out. And last, very important, is do you have cannibalization occurring because you actually have duplication? And at which point does the customer look at it and say, these are essentially the same, so I'm going to swap out. Historically, though, these structures were typically created in a very firm fashion and were ones that were published out as ways that you looked at it. And in many ways, these no longer apply to understanding the customer. And the reason why is because the customer changes, and the customer changes over time. So these decision trees have to be created and revalidated, and it's a technique that inside of big data and predictive analytics, you can look at each of these attributes. You can then decide which ones are correlated to sales as you look at them. This technique is key to getting the attributes and then understanding which ones matter and understanding how you build out your assortment. But with big data and predictive analytics, you can go through each of the attributes and provide that capability. A second technique, which is important here, is to avoid the self-fulfilling prophecy. And the self-fulfilling prophecy is if you just look at one store, what ends up is you don't get to look at what is going on in other stores. An example here, we've got 4 different store locations, and we've got what are the percentages of sales by attribute of each of these different ones. And as you look across left to right, what you're going to see is they're radically different in terms of those product features at the top. The second attribute, which is price, and then the third attribute, which is material. And you'll notice as you look left to right, for instance, Atlanta in material in brushed nickel has 28%, but Denver for brushed nickel has 46%. So we want to be able to look at, what are the differences, how are they the same in each of these different areas. One of the ways you can use this is to then determine, what are similar markets to each other and what are the products that they need. Here's an example. Charlotte and Denver are similar markets in many ways. Now, even though they're geographically, very distinctly different, on a product basis and on an attribute basis for the customers, they're very similar in terms of how the customers shop. So we look across the 2 different stores and we create, in essence, a neighborhood that provides a technique that you could look at those 2 stores and look at what products one carries that the other does not, and what is the revenue associated with each one, so that you can expand on what types of products might somebody buy, even though they're not in a particular store. We look at a similar store or a sister store, if you want to put it that way, inside of a neighborhood of like stores, in order to see what's going on between the different ones, in order to find out the attributes that are moving. It also allows you to look at trends, and it allows you to look at, over time, how you need to change the assortment based upon patterns that you're actually seeing. Variation is obviously something that you want to measure across these different stores. And as you can see here, the patterns of what is the stores and the demand shares across them varies radically. And this concept is one that you can use to then determine how many clusters you want to have. If you would look at a very flat bell-shaped curve that didn't rise very high, what's going to happen is it indicates that there is a lot of variation across stores. On the other hand, as you can see with these demand shares on each of these two, you might indicate that there is some level of clustering which makes sense because the demand shares in the number of stores have some level of similarity. So the tighter the curve, the less granularity you need, the more expanded out it is. And as you can see here, you can actually measure that across the different attributes in the customer decision tree, which are critical and important to the consumer. The way that you would look at it, and what you see here is an illustration. It's a bit hard to see, but what you're seeing is one cluster on the left. What happens if you do 2 clusters with demand, and what happens if you do 3 clusters to the right? The light-blue in the difference between each one shows you what is the incremental revenue/profit that you can get by going from 1 cluster on the left to 2 clusters on the right. Then you can see as you move one more to the right, there's even more incremental benefit that can be gained. Another way to visualize this is the following. If you look at this chart, it pretty much shows you that if you had a unique assortment for each store, it is as much as a 5.5% revenue increase left to right. If you did a traditional size clustering technique, you might have, say, for sake of argument, 5 different clusters. You can see where that actually is on the graph. And then you can see as you go across, in this case, all the way to N number of stores, what that differential is. So in this case, it would indicate that if you've only got 5 clusters, you're not optimizing against the customer preference and demand, which is there. And if you went all the way to the right, it would be more. If this curve were to flatten out, it's potential that you would seek some level in between. So that idea of what is the right amount of granularity can be determined algorithmically using this technique.
Attribute demand modeling, which is so critical in achieving the right assortment decisions, can also be utilized in other areas of the organization. The effect of really understanding your consumer buying patterns is critical not just within the assortment or supply chain area, but can be used elsewhere. So segmenting customers based on their buying habits is a common practice among successful retailers. By understanding what drives a customer to purchase, retailers can also identify key strategies for personalizing the relationship, and we see that quite a bit in the promotion applications that are focused on this effort. And when the buying patterns of a customer are understood, a retailer has the ability to promote more effectively, whereby increasing that total basket size. The effect of attribute demand modeling on helping a chain understand specifically which combination of attributes will achieve the highest demand really is one of the most important aspects of getting your assortment right. So how can attribute demand help you evaluate new products? First, you can look for high projected demand of attribute combinations that don't currently exist in the chain. And we talked about this a little bit earlier on in the conversation. These could be products that are carried by your supplier or offer opportunities to partner and design new products. Additionally, by, again, understanding substitution among these attributes, you can determine if filling the white space will increase revenue or simply cannibalize other product sales. A key to any successful assortment process should require few changes to your existing workflow. If anything, it should reduce the manual intervention, whereby freeing up personnel to focus on other key tasks in your organization. Estimating demand is the first step, which requires automation to effectively understand lost sales, anomalies, and substitution. While normalizing product attributes and understanding the consumer decision tree is important, this task is typically managed one time with minor changes occurring over time as presented in the forecast displayed. Next, a strong optimization engine is going to provide a quick and easy visualization to the recommendations at both a summary and detail level. This should make operational changes easy to anticipate, as well as to share throughout your organization. Additionally, the results will likely deploy into existing assortment management applications. So you really don't have to tear up your infrastructure in order to accommodate. Selecting a manageable pilot can help to validate the optimization results. And once you deploy across the chain, an assortment optimization tool should closely manage and communicate updates to the assortment based on customer-defined thresholds. So traditionally, in the old method of defining assortments, where you went in on an annual basis, the real key to an effective optimization engine is going to be to continuously monitor the assortment changes and alert users when assortment changes need to happen. Implementing the assortment optimization engine is likely one of the best decisions the retailer can make, and Kevin talked about this in the earlier slides. The return on investment, as discussed, is significant, while interestingly, the IT and operational investment is typically minimal. Once the data is reviewed and normalized, the business process changes are typically centered around the review process and selection of a pilot. Once deployed, the only additional decisions are how often the tool should alert you to assortment changes that then could result in material impacts.
So the big questions that we would have expected most people to have at the beginning, we're summarizing through all of the different slides. But in essence, the first question that most people would have before they would activate any sort of a new project of this sort is this worth it? Are localized assortments and this technique of doing big data instead of using a process-oriented / size-based tool worth it? And I would think overwhelmingly a 3 to 20% revenue improvement by category is worth it for virtually anyone. The second question that a lot of people have within it is, do they have the big data that is needed for this? And our experience is that absolutely yes, they do, but some of it may need to be normalized and analyzed. What I mean by that is the following. You may have an attribute which is flavor, and then in your actual data, you might have a word like chocolate spelled a number of different ways, or you may even have it normalized to different fashions in the data. Dark chocolate, white chocolate, milk chocolate, and so forth. Some of them matter, some of them don't, so you need to determine that. Similarly, things like price, which are widely varied and have an extreme on one end to the other end, you do need to normalize them into price bands. We can do that with the data. We can find out what matters to the customer within those. But big data out there, it just needs to go through this normalization technique, and it's one of the upfront component and parts of what you need to do. How long does all of this take? Typical question. It's very quick. Less than 6 months. It can be even less than that if the data is available and can be put into the models. That's pretty much start to finish to actually make it operational and to use the technique. A lot of this is SaaS-based architecture to where it's a web interface. So very fast, very easy to use, and as we pointed out, it doesn't take a lot of IT resource to be able to do it because you're extracting and you're putting it into this capability and then feeding it back into what we call ADRs, add, delete, retain by location. Very easy to use and operationalize. And last question is, why or how would I be able to get started to be able to do some of this? And running a pilot's the best way, is take some of the data, feed it through, try a pilot, see what your results are within each category. Typically people have pet projects and pet categories or areas that they want to work on. That's typically the way to get started is start small, do a crawl, walk, run type of a methodology as it goes through. With that, I'll hand it over to Adam to do the wrap-up and hopefully open up for a few of the questions.
Well, thank you, Kevin and Marcia, for your insights. Before we get to the questions, I do want to remind the audience to please share their feedback on the session and the entire webinar series by taking a very quick survey. As I said earlier, there's two ways to take it. You can click on the icon that's circled in red here at the bottom of the taskbar, or you can wait until the session concludes when it will launch automatically, and we do appreciate your feedback. So we did get some questions in from the audience. The first one I think is directed to you, Kevin. What's the best way to determine if our attributes are strong enough for attribute demand modeling?
Sure. Great question. Many people have kind of preconceived notions about, their decision trees and their attributes and ideas around it. Once we can actually load in the information and build out the models, what we can do is we can look at it, we can normalize, we can cleanse it, and there are statistical techniques that we have to look at a particular attribute and see how highly it correlates to the sales and to the customer demand. So you can plot that out and look at it. An interesting side point to all of this is many times category managers or buyers will have preconceived notions about how do their customers shop their category, or what attributes they think are important, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's a little different than what everybody's preconceived notion is once you start looking at the data and finding out what it is. But it's not only is it straightforward, but the quote-unquote question as of what is strong enough, we can actually give you an absolute measure as to correlation of that attribute.
Great. Okay. Good. This next question, I believe, Marcia, is directed to you. What factors should be evaluated when determining operational overhead versus benefit from localization?
Yeah, this tends to be really one of the key questions we get quite a bit in terms of, how much benefit do I need to see in order to create that more granular assortment. And really it comes down to understanding how automated or what level of effort is required within your replenishment application or processes, as well as some of your pricing and promotion processes. And then really comparing that to that incremental benefit that was defined. Having a very easy way to share those results with your regions and or store groupings really will help in identifying where do you draw that line. Most importantly, I'd say don't be afraid to change your localization decisions over time. It's important to look at these things category by category and keep in mind that what's right for one category is not necessarily right for another category. So plopping everything into an A, B, and C type scenario is really a very old way of looking at localization, and by using these understanding your consumer buying patterns, that's really what's going to help drive where the right localization is going to occur.
Great point. Yeah, the localization is definitely something that seems like it's important for some specific categories or products, and important to some consumer groups versus others. So you really need to be flexible on that, it sounds like. We do have time for one more question. How do you determine if assortment decisions should be centralized or decentralized?
A great question, because a lot of people operationally currently have it oriented one way or the other and are looking at this as potentially an operational change. Our recommendation is to centralize this decision if optimization is implemented. And what we mean is, if you use this attribute-based technique to analyze, you're automatically going to be bringing in local store preferences and decentralized thought process in. So you would centralize the main sets as it goes in, and then you use the capability of regional folks or local people to look at what's being done. Can be overridden, but you still allow the main central process to run. And that way you can look at it locally so that folks, and many times what happens is local or regional personnel look at what's been generated and say, oh yeah, that's absolutely what I thought. This makes sense because these attributes are what our consumers are looking for in our area, et cetera, et cetera. So in many ways, it's purely more of a second technique, which is validation. And it's also, with using this technique, is a good way to do it centrally, send it out, get it validated, is a good way to look at it and make sure that all of the business rules have been addressed early on so that you achieve optimum results, both operationally as well as what you can get from revenue increases by localization.
Okay, great. Well, as I said, unfortunately, we're about out of time today. If anyone who put in a question didn't receive an answer, the speakers will be able to follow up after the presentation is done. I want to encourage everyone to please plan to join Retail Touchpoints Live for the 2018 Retail Innovation Conference, which is going to be held April 30th through May 2nd in New York City. It's going to be a great event. You can find more details at www.retailinnovationconference.com. That includes who the speakers are and a great idea about what some of the educational tracks are. I want to thank, again, the panelists, Kevin and Marcia, for their insights, and thank you to all the attendees. Please enjoy the rest of your day.